Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we're jumping into a really pivotal time, the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Absolutely. This period saw arguably the most profound changes in warfare, really setting the stage for, well, the next 200 years of military
We're
thinking.
not just talking small adjustments here, are we?
No, not at all. We're talking about a huge political and social upheaval that basically weaponized the whole idea of the nation. It's like Gregor Knox puts it, this is when war started to approach what Clausewitz famously called its true character, its absolute perfection.
Wow. Okay, so our mission for this deep dive is to unpack military innovation in revolutionary France. We want to get under the hood, really see how these massive political shifts, this, sudden explosion of national identity and rapid institutional changes just completely transformed armies.
Right. How did they go from what Casey Baker calls beasts of burden to the soldat citoyen, the citizen soldier?
Exactly. And we're grounding this entirely in scholarly work, looking at analyses from people like McGregor Knox, Jordan R. Hayworth, Jonathan A. Abel.
Solid academic sources.
So the big question, the one we really want to tackle for you today, is how did France go from being, well, just another old regime power, often limited, often beaten, to this force that could just roll over its opponents across Europe, campaign after campaign?
Yeah, what was the engine behind that shift? How did they unleash this terrifying absolute perfection of war that Clausewitz saw?
Okay, so to really get the scale of the change, we need to understand the starting point, right?
Sure.
The baseline. What was warfare like before 1789?
Well, you have to understand the political context first. McGregor Knox describes pre-1789 Europe as being made up of these rigidly hierarchical societies divided into occupational groups or castes, think estates, guilds, that sort of thing.
Very structured, very layered, and that structure dictated everything.
Pretty much. Especially foreign policy and war. Those were strictly the business of the monarchs and their ministers, and their number one priority. It wasn't necessarily winning territory abroad.
It was keeping order at home.
Exactly. Maintaining internal stability was paramount. If fighting a war risked upsetting that delicate social balance, well, it often wasn't seen as worth it.
So they weren't going all in very often.
No. War aims were usually pretty limited. Maybe grab a few colonies or provinces, as Knox says. You didn't gamble the existence of the state or risk internal chaos for just a bit more land. That political reality meant the military itself operated under some serious constraints.
McGregor Knox talks about a triple threat to decisiveness, right? What were those?
Yeah, it's a useful framework. First, limitations on mass and motivation. Second, mobility and logistics. And third, tactical effectiveness, or rather, the lack of it leading to indecisive battles.
Okay, let's break down number one, mass and motivation. Who actually fought in these 18th century armies?
Well, it wasn't the respectable folks, that's for sure. The Comte de Guibert, writing back in 1773, called them the lowest la plus vil and most pitiful segment of the citizens and of foreigners, of vagabonds.
Ouch. So not exactly motivated patriots.
Not even close. These were guys who were often press-ganged, tricked, or just desperate for a meal. They had zero loyalty to the king or the cause, really.
Which must have created huge problems for commanders. How do you get soldiers like that to fight?
Brutal discipline. That was the only answer they had. Frederick the Great of Prussia spelled it out in his testament of 1768. He said troops must, and I quote, fear their officers more than all the dangers to which they may be exposed.
So terror was the main motivator. Keep them more scared of their own officers than the enemy.
Precisely. It's what some historians call cadaver horsum corpse obedience. Without that fear, Knox points out, these guys would just melt away when faced with real danger, like 300 muskets thundering at them. You simply couldn't trust them.
And the social structure made this worse, didn't it?
Absolutely. The upper classes, the nobles, even gainfully employed townspeople, they were all exempt from service. So the state couldn't tap into the most educated or potentially motivated parts of society. They were stuck drawing from the pool least likely to want to be there.
Okay, so if you can't trust your soldiers not to run away, that leads straight into the second constraint, mobility and logistics.
Right. Desertion was a constant nightmare for commanders. If you let your troops spread out to forage for food, well, a good chunk of them just wouldn't come back.
So no living off the land.
No. Operations were rigidly tied to supply depots, these huge magazines. Armies had to crawl along, supplied by endless wagon trains. McGregor Knox calls the system laborious, and it put a hard cap on everything.
How big could armies get, and how far could they go?
Not very big, and not very far. You were generally looking at armies of maybe 70,000 men, max. And they couldn't operate much more than 50 to 70 miles away from their main supply base. It made warfare incredibly slow and predictable.
And vulnerable, I imagine. Those supply lines sound like a huge weakness.
Absolutely fatal. If the enemy could get around your flank and cut that supply line, your army wasn't just defeated, it would disintegrate. It would starve. Or the soldiers would just desert en masse.
And they didn't have the kind of organization to cope with that, like modern divisions?
No, not really. The lack of sophisticated, self-sufficient units like combined arms divisions just made the whole logistical problem worse. Deep, fast, decisive campaigns were basically impossible under this system.
Which brings us neatly to the third constraint, decisiveness, or the lack thereof.
Yeah. Given the limited political aims and how expensive and fragile these armies were, commanders were extremely reluctant to risk everything on a single battle. Seeking a decision at all costs, as Knox puts it, just wasn't rational most of the time. Why gamble your precious army for a minor province?
And the way they fought reflected this caution.
Completely. Tactically, the fear of desertion meant you couldn't really use skirmishers or open-order tactics effectively. If soldiers spread out too much, you might lose control, they might run. So fighting was mostly done in rigid, linear formations, trading volleys.
And what about after the battle? If you won, could you actually finish the enemy off?
That's the crucial part Knox emphasizes. Pursuit the key to actually destroying a defeated enemy and making a victory strategically meaningful was incredibly risky. Pursuit means breaking formation, it means chaos, speed, small units operating independently.
All the things an 18th century commander feared most because of desertion.
Exactly. So, when one side had had enough, they'd conduct an orderly withdrawal, and the winner would usually let them go. Battles were often indecisive encounters, not annihilations.
Okay, so that's the picture. Slow, costly, fragile armies, tightly controlled by monarchs focused on internal stability, leading to limited, indecisive wars.
That's the stage. Now let's bring on the French Revolution and watch it tear down every single one of those constraints.
So 1788 to 1794, the French Revolution. This wasn't just a political change, it was a fundamental shift in identity, wasn't it?
It really was. MacGregor Knox stresses this point. The revolution wasn't just about overthrowing the king. It established this powerful, almost explosive idea that France wasn't just the king's property, it was la nation, an entity defined by shared language and culture, a collective people.
And this nation was made up of citizens?
Theoretically, yes. Citizens free and equal under the law, as Knox says, adding pointedly, and the guillotine. That idea of radical equality, symbolized by things like executing Louis VI in January 93, was a direct threat to every other monarchy in Europe.
It basically declared war on the old order.
It did. And the revolutionaries, especially the Girondins, leaned into it. They weren't talking about limited gains. They called the war a true blessing, a national blessing. They saw it as a crusade, a world war of peoples against kings.
A cosmic mission, almost.
Knox uses that exact phrase, a mission to save humanity through, well, sacred violence. And this wasn't just rhetoric for the politicians in Paris. It had a direct, terrifying impact on the battlefield.
How so?
We have Clausewitz's eyewitness account from 1793. He was a young Prussian officer then, and he described feeling the colossal weight of the whole French people, unhinged by political fanaticism, came crashing down upon us.
Wow. You can feel the shock in that statement. Imagine being an old regime soldier facing that. Instead of poorly motivated mercenaries, you're up against hundreds of thousands of people who genuinely believe they're fighting for freedom, for the nation, for survival.
It's a completely different psychological dynamic. And this new political reality swept away all the old limits on what the state could do.
No more worrying about upsetting the nobles.
Not a bit. The revolutionaries claimed an unlimited right to wage war, an unlimited right of conquest. They enforced loyalty through intense domestic surveillance, the reign of terror. And, crucially for the military, they fundamentally changed logistics.
This is where living off the land comes back in.
Yes. They embraced that old idea from Guibert, which Knox highlights. France would nourish war by war. Plunder and requisitioning weren't just tolerated, they became the official logistical system.
Was this driven purely by ideology, or was there a practical need too?
Very much a practical need. The early attempts to raise armies, calling for volunteers from 1789 to 1792, just weren't enough. Jordan Hayworth points out the problems. You had thousands of experienced aristocratic officers emigrating, about 6,000, gone by late 91.
A huge brain drain.
Massive. And the regular soldiers they did have often deserted to join the National Guard because the pay was better. The old military system was collapsing even as the need for soldiers exploded,
So they needed a radical solution.
and they found one. The pivot point was the levée en masse, declared on August 16, 1793. This was basically the first modern national draft. It wasn't just asking for volunteers. It mobilized the entire population, men, women, resources, everything for the war effort.
The scale must have been unprecedented.
Absolutely staggering.
Yeah.
By 1794, the French army ballooned to around 750,000 troops. And these weren't short-term soldiers. They were expected to serve until, quote, every enemy has been driven from the territory of the Republic. The constraints on army size. Gone. Motivation. Radically transformed.
This creates the citizen soldier, the soldat citoyen.
Exactly. These weren't the lowest and most pitiful anymore. In Knox's words, they were our friends, fellows, citizens, and soldiers of the patrie. They were fighting for their nation.
And that meant they were less likely to desert.
Much less likely. That deep-seated nationalism gave commanders something they'd never really had before. Trust in their men. The paralyzing fear of desertion that hobbled old regime armies began to lift.
But there was a catch initially, wasn't there? This revolutionary spirit sometimes clashed with military necessity.
Yes, there was a definite paradox. Early on, some revolutionaries almost celebrated indiscipline as a virtue, seeing it as a rejection of the robotic obedience of the old royal army. But, well,
You can't actually run an effective army like that.
you really can't. Military reality bites hard. Jordan Hayworth highlights how Lazare Carnot, the key organizer on the Committee of Public Safety, had to crack down. By 1793, he brought in harsh punishments for insubordination, for looting.
So they had to find a balance.
They did. By 1794, the rhetoric and the reality started to merge. They managed to combine that citizen-soldier spirit, that élan, with what Hayworth calls a willful acceptance of discipline. Now they had it all. Mass, motivation, and structure.
Okay, so France now has this massive, motivated, and increasingly disciplined army. But how do you actually use it effectively? How do you command hundreds of thousands of troops spread across huge distances?
This is where we see the real emergence of what we now call the operational level of war.
Yeah.
Before, you basically had strategy, the overall political goals and tactics, what happens on the battlefield.
Right, 2 levels.
The French Revolutionary Wars really solidified this intermediate level operations. It's the art and science of planning and conducting campaigns to achieve those strategic goals. It's about linking battles together, maneuvering large forces over space and time.
And Jordan Hayworth points out that French thinkers were already heading this way before the revolution.
Yes, particularly Guibert. He didn't use the word strategy quite like we do, but he talked about elementary tactics, the actual fighting and grand tactics, which covered much of what we'd call operations and strategy today. The ideas were there.
So what was the key organizational change that allowed them to manage these huge new armies at the operational level?
The divisional system. But Hayworth is careful to note this wasn't invented out of thin air by the revolutionaries. It was more of an evolution, building on late old regime reforms.
How did it help with the old problems like logistics?
Well, think back to Marshal de Broglie's experiments in the 1750s and 60s. He created temporary combined arms divisions units with their own infantry, cavalry, artillery. He realized that by letting these divisions march separately,
They could spread out and live off the land more easily and move faster.
exactly, they could requisition supplies from a wider area without needing those cumbersome wagon trains from the magazines quite so much. Then they could concentrate rapidly for battle.
So the revolutionaries took this experimental idea and made it standard doctrine.
Pretty much. Guibert's 1772 essay had already advocated living off the land to increase speed. He pushed for a war of movement, aiming to envelop and destroy the enemy army, not just capture fortresses or provinces.
Less siege warfare, more decisive battles.
Right. And the French state then put this into official regulations. The 1791 Infantry Manual laid out the tactical system, and a 1792 regulation specifically called for offensive attacks, followed by rapid pursuit. Annihilation was becoming the goal.
Yeah, you still had the problem of merging the old professional soldiers with all these new recruits, right? How did they create a cohesive army?
That was the amalgamation policy introduced after 1793. This was absolutely crucial. They literally fused the experienced veterans from the old Royal Army with the enthusiastic but green volunteers and conscripts.
How did they do that structurally?
They created new units called demi-brigades. Typically, 1 battalion of old regulars was combined with 2 battalions of new troops.
So you get a blend in every unit.
Exactly. You get the discipline and know-how from the veterans, infused with the patriotic fervor and sheer numbers of the new citizen soldiers. Jordan Hayworth calls this essential for creating a unified, professional force out of that massive, raw manpower pool. It was smart social engineering as much as military organization.
Okay, so you have the mass, the motivation, the operational structure with divisions, and the amalgam creating cohesion. What did this look like on the battlefield itself? How did tactics change?
This is where McGregor-Knox highlights the birth of the modern, flexible battlefield, because commanders could now trust their soldiers not to desert at the first opportunity.
They have more options.
Many more. They could finally use skirmishers, effectively citizen soldiers willing to fight in open order, scouting ahead, or harassing the enemy, screening their own movements. That was almost impossible before.
What about formations? Still just rigid lines.
No. Commanders could now freely switch between different formations depending on the situation. They could use columns for rapid movement to punch through enemy lines. They could deploy skirmishers in broken terrain. And they could still form the line for the decisive firefight when needed.
And pursuit became possible.
Not just possible, but expected. Because the troops were reliable, you could finally unleash them to pursue a beaten enemy and turn a victory into a rout, an annihilation.
Was there any technological factor supporting this?
Yes, definitely. We shouldn't forget the artillery reforms under the Comte de Gribeauval back in the 1770s. He standardized French artillery, making the guns lighter, more mobile, and more reliable.
So the guns could keep up with the faster-moving infantry columns and divisions.
Precisely. Gribeauval's mobile field artillery provided the flexible firepower needed to support this new, faster, more decisive style of warfare. It was a key technological enabler for the operational art the French were developing.
Okay, so the theory sounds brilliant. Mass, motivation, divisions, flexibility, pursuit. But how did it actually work out when they first tried to implement it?
Well, the first attempts were pretty disastrous. That initial invasion of the Austrian Netherlands in April 1792 was a complete fiasco.
Why? What went wrong?
Fundamentally, a lack of training and discipline among those early volunteer units. Jordan Hayworth tells this really grim story about General Theobald Dillon. His column basically encountered a small Austrian patrol, panicked completely, and fled.
They just ran.
Worse, in their terror and confusion, they decided they must have been betrayed by their officers, so they turned on Dillon and murdered him.
Good grief, that shows how raw things were.
It really does. These early failures showed that revolutionary passion alone wasn't enough. You needed structure, training, discipline. The early system, without strong central command and control, was just too weak.
So when did things start to turn around? Was Valmy the key? September 1792.
Valmy was crucial, yes, but maybe not in the way you'd think. Strategically, it was massive. The Prussians were halted, Paris was saved, the revolution survived. Huge confidence boost.
But operationally, you said earlier it was more like an old regime battle.
Exactly. The Allied commander, the Duke of Brunswick, was playing by the old rules. Jordan Hayworth points out he was totally focused on capturing fortresses like Longwy and Verdun, securing his supply lines back to Germany. Very 18th century.
And he was slow, wasn't he?
Incredibly slow. And that delay was critical. His infamous manifesto threatening to destroy Paris if the king was harmed. It completely backfired. It just enraged the Parisians, led to the storming of the Tuileries Palace, and the formal abolition of the monarchy just before Valmy. He radicalized his enemy.
So when the battle actually happened...
Brunswick attacked mainly because the French under Dumouriez were threatening his precious lines of operation. The battle itself was mostly an artillery duel. Casualties were pretty light, and afterwards, Dumouriez let Brunswick's army retreat in good order. No pursuit, no annihilation.
So a strategic win for France, but operationally, they hadn't quite figured out the new way of war yet.
Not yet. And that failure to crush the Prussians, combined with commanders like Dumouriez actually defecting to the Austrians later, well, that terrified the government in Paris.
Led to paranoia? The terror?
Yes. It confirmed all their suspicions about unreliable generals. This led directly to the Reign of Terror and the Committee of Public Safety taking tight, centralized control over the military. No more trusting potentially disloyal commanders.
And this is where Lazare Carnot comes in, the organizer of victory.
The key figure. Carnot was a genius engineer, politician, strategist. He wasn't interested in compromise or limited victories. He demanded the total annihilation of the coalition armies. No negotiation.
How did he plan to achieve that?
By using France's newfound mass. Jordan Hayworth explained Carnot's approach. Concentrate overwhelming numbers at the strategically decisive points. Use that numerical superiority to force the Allies to fight where and when France wanted them to, under the worst possible circumstances for them. It was about imposing France's will through numbers and maneuver.
And by 1794, the system was ready for this.
Yes, the divisional structure was working properly. Generals like Jourdan were commanding large formations, effectively wing commands, that operated much like the later corps system. They could finally handle the scale and complexity Carnot demanded.
So this 1794 campaign in Belgium, that was the test case.
That was the big one. Carnot planned a massive strategic envelopment of the Allied forces there. Jourdan's army of the Sambre and Meuse, maybe 90,000 strong by then, battle-hardened troops was the main instrument.
And how did the Austrians react?
Their commander, Coburg, was forced to abandon the cautious old regime style. Jourdan was threatening his supply lines back to the Rhine, so Coburg had to fight aggressively to defend them.
Which led to the Battle of Second Fleurus, June 1794.
Right. And Fleurus was a major French victory. Strategically decisive, it forced Coburg to retreat, abandon Belgium, essentially. France conquered the whole region.
But was it the annihilation Carnot wanted?
Interestingly, no. Jordan Hayworth points out that while it was decisive strategically, it wasn't tactically an annihilation battle. Jourdan's army was exhausted after the fight. They couldn't mount an effective large-scale pursuit to destroy Coburg's retreating army.
So even with the new system and ideology, there were still practical limits.
Absolutely. It shows that even with the theory of absolute war, the physical realities of campaigning supply, exhaustion, friction meant that achieving total annihilation in a conventional campaign was still incredibly difficult, even for the best revolutionary generals. The potential was there, but realizing it consistently was another matter.
Okay, so the revolution created this powerful new military machine, but it was still maybe a bit raw, still learning, still subject to political turmoil, like the Thermidorian reaction that followed the terror.
Exactly. And that political instability, leading to the Directory government in 1795, actually caused the army to shrink again quite significantly. Hayworth notes it dropped from that peak of 750,000 down to maybe 480,000 by 95. Disease, desertion starting to creep back in as the initial fervor cooled and the state struggled financially.
And the money problems affected logistics again.
Big time. The Directory was basically broke. They couldn't reliably supply the armies through the state anymore. This forced them to fully embrace that policy of guerre war, must-feed war. Plundering occupied territories wasn't just an option, it became a necessity.
So a bit of a messy situation, brilliant potential in the doctrine and organization, but facing real practical problems.
A very volatile mix. And it's into this environment that Napoleon Bonaparte emerges as a major commander. We know his background artillery officer commissioned back in 85, rose incredibly fast during the Revolution, made brigadier general by 1794.
And in 1796, he gets command of the Army of Italy, which wasn't exactly a prime assignment, was it?
No, it was seen as a bit of a backwater. A small army, poorly equipped, poorly supplied. But Bonaparte saw opportunity where others saw problems. He looked at the rich plains of Lombardy in northern Italy.
And saw a source of supply.
Exactly. Hayworth points out he essentially weaponized the guerre necessity. He told his ragged troops they'd find glory, honor, and crucially riches and food in Italy. Victory wasn't just strategic. It was survival and reward. Win and you eat. Win and you get paid through plunder.
Talk about motivation. And that first Italian campaign, 1796-97, becomes the classic demonstration of this new way of war, mastered by him.
Absolutely. It's where he shows his complete grasp of operational art. He understood how to use the speed and flexibility of the divisional system. He consistently applied the principle of march divided, fight united, using those combined arms formations to move quickly along separate routes.
And then concentrate overwhelming force right at the decisive point, hitting the enemy before they knew what was happening.
Precisely. His first move was to drive a wedge between the armies of Piedmont, Sardinia, and their Austrian allies, beating them separately before they could combine against him. Classic divide and conquer, enabled by speed.
And he wasn't just attacking head-on, he focused on their vulnerabilities.
He perfected the maneuver sur les derrières, the maneuver onto the enemy's rear. Think about his move against the Austrian General Bulli early on. Instead of just pushing against Bulli's front, Bonaparte daringly crossed the Po River further downstream at Piacenza.
What did that achieve?
It put his army squarely between Beaulieu and his supply lines, his route back to Austria. It wasn't just a tactical threat. It was an existential threat to Beaulieu's entire army.
So Beaulieu had to react, had to abandon his own plans just to save his army.
He had no choice but to retreat, which allowed Bonaparte to continue his strategic advance. That's the power of attacking the lines of operation. You threaten the enemy's ability to function, forcing them onto the defensive. It's fundamentally different from the old attritional battles. Hayworth really details this strategic envelopment.
And he used defense cleverly, too. Unlike Jourdan and Fleurus, who seemed more passive after the main battle.
Right. Bonaparte used the fortress of Mantua, which the Austrians were desperate to relieve, almost like bait. He knew they'd have to come at him, probably dividing their forces to try and trap him.
And when they did,
He pounced. The battles of Lonato and Castiglione in August 96 are textbook examples. The Austrian commander, Wurmser, split his army, trying to relieve Mantua from different directions around Lake Garda. Bonaparte, using his central position and rapid marches, smashed one Austrian column, then turned and hit the other. Concentration against dispersion.
speed and timing were everything.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
But the absolute peak, the most stunning example of this concentration, was probably the Battle of Rivoli in January 1797.
What happened there?
Another Austrian relief attempt, this time under General Alvinzi. Bonaparte realized the main Austrian thrust was coming down from the north through the Brenner Pass towards Rivoli. He needed to concentrate forces there incredibly quickly to stop it.
This required pushing his troops to the limit.
To the absolute limit. Hayworth calls it the most impressive example of concentration. Bonaparte was shifting divisions around rapidly, demanding forced marches. The most famous is General Massena's division.
The 30-mile march.
That's the one. They marched incredible distances, arrived just in time at La Favorita, near Mantua, to block Wurmser, who was besieged inside, from breaking out to join Alvinzi. Then elements turned around and marched back towards Rivoli to hit Alvinzi's flank.
Unbelievable endurance. And it worked.
Perfectly. Massena's timely arrival helped shatter Alvinzi's attack. It showed the system working at peak efficiency. Speed, maneuver, concentration of mass at the decisive point, all enabled by the divisional structure and the sheer will of the commander and his troops.
Okay, so if we try to boil down the Napoleonic system that emerged from this, what are the key components?
Well, strategically, our sources point to Napoleon's own genius and leadership, obviously, but also his ability to effectively wield the sheer mass that the revolution had unleashed.
And operationally and tactically.
It's the mastery of the combined arms division, and then grouping those divisions into flexible all-arms army corps. This is what truly elevated warfare to the level of operationally focused, decisive victories.
And he kept the mass mobilization going.
Oh, yes. MacGregor Knox notes he formalized it with the Jordan Law of 1798. That conscription system brought in something like 2 million Frenchmen between 1800 and 1814. The corps system was the key to managing these enormous armies, allowing them to march dispersed over wide areas, feeding themselves as they went, but then concentrate rapidly for battle, screened by cavalry.
So he took all the potential the revolution had created, the mass, the doctrine, the organization, and perfected its application through his own genius.
Essentially, yes. He fully internalized the ideas of theorists like Guibert and put them into practice with unmatched skill and determination. That combination made him, for a time, unbeatable.
It sounds like this system, while incredibly powerful, really depended on having someone like Bonaparte at the helm to make it work to its full potential.
That's a really important point. The system itself wasn't foolproof. Its effectiveness was highly dependent on the commander's vision, aggression, and ability to handle complexity and risk. And we see this clearly when Napoleon, after seizing power in late 1799, expected his other generals to operate the same way he did.
They couldn't always replicate it.
Not consistently. The 1800 campaign provides a fascinating contrast between Napoleon in Italy and General Moreau commanding the main army on the Rhine.
Moreau had a good army, didn't he?
He had arguably the best army France possessed at that time. According to Hayworth, about 108,000 well-organized, well-supplied troops on the Rhine. Excellent circumstances.
And Napoleon had a plan for him, probably involving a maneuver sur le derrière.
You guessed it, classic Bonaparte. He wanted Moreau to execute a swift, decisive maneuver through the Black Forest, getting behind the Austrian army under Marshal Kray, cutting his supply lines, and forcing him into a disastrous battle.
And Moreau's reaction.
He balked. He resisted the plan vigorously. Hayworth details Moreau's objections. He claimed he couldn't risk living off the land, that securing the river crossings over the Rhine was too difficult. He even threatened to resign rather than carry out Napoleon's aggressive plan.
He preferred a safer approach.
Much safer. He opted for a slower, more complicated, less risky flanking maneuver. It completely lacked the speed and decisiveness Napoleon wanted.
Napoleon must have been tearing his hair out.
He was furious. He saw Moreau's caution as fundamentally misunderstanding the new way of war. Hayworth quotes a letter from Bonaparte to Carnot about Moreau. The success of the campaign depends on the speed with which you operate. If you execute a swift movement decisively and with all determination, Italy and the peace will be ours. He saw Moreau's slowness not just as inefficient, but as potentially endangering the entire strategic situation.
Did Moreau eventually win?
He did win a major victory, yes, but not in the way Napoleon had intended. His decisive battle came much later in the year, at Hohenlinden, December 3, 1800.
How did that battle unfold? Was it a brilliant offensive maneuver?
No, ironically, it was more of a defensive victory that turned into a devastating counterattack. The Austrians, under the young Archduke John, basically blundered. They advanced aggressively through thick forests, got their columns tangled and disconnected, and Moreau expertly exploited their mistakes.
So Moreau was clearly a capable general.
Very capable. Hohenlinden was a brilliant tactical victory, but the comparison with Napoleon is stark. Moreau needed favorable circumstances and enemy mistakes to achieve his decisive win. Napoleon, especially in Italy in 96-97 and again in 1800, demonstrated the ability to create decisive opportunities through bold, offensive operational art, often against the odds, forcing the enemy to conform to his plan.
Hayworth suggests Moreau was maybe more comfortable with the older style.
That's his assessment. Moreau was perhaps a master of the previous strategic era, but he lacked the almost reckless audacity and strategic vision needed to fully exploit the potential of the new Napoleonic system. It highlights that the system required a specific kind of genius to reach that absolute perfection. #outro.
So wrapping this up, the transformation in warfare during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods was just immense.
Absolutely. As MacGregor Knox powerfully argues, it wasn't just a military change. It was driven by a fundamental political and ideological revolution. France introduced true national warfare to Europe, mobilizing the entire power of the nation on a scale never seen before.
Okay, so for you listening, what are the big takeaways from this deep dive?
I think there are three key things. First, military innovation rarely happens in a vacuum. It's almost always linked to deeper political and social changes. The ideas and technologies like Gribeauval's guns or Guibert's theories often exist beforehand. It took the revolution, the nation-state, to provide the ideology and the manpower to truly unlock their potential.
Right. Politics enabled military transformation. What's the second takeaway?
The formal emergence of the operational level of war. This changed what was expected of generals. It wasn't just about winning a battle. It was about conducting campaigns involving movement, concentration, logistics, and achieving decisive strategic results, far beyond what old regime commanders typically aimed for or could achieve.
And third,
it's the combination of the organizational tools, the combined arms division, and later the corps system, with the sheer mass provided by the levée en masse. That combination, in the hands of a genius like Napoleon, was what turned warfare from indecisive maneuvering into a quest for annihilation battles. Mass plus mobility plus leadership.
and this had huge social consequences too, didn't it? Beyond just the battlefield.
Immense. Our sources really emphasize this. Think about it. Armies suddenly being led effectively by commoners, officers rising through merit, and the whole thing commanded by someone like Napoleon, born to minor nobility in Corsica, not a high aristocrat from Paris.
That must have shaken the old aristocratic order of Europe to its core.
Completely. It called the entire social hierarchy into question. This idea that merit, talent, and national service could replace birthright and privilege within the military? Well, that principle deeply influenced how military organizations developed for the next 2 centuries. It's a foundation of modern professional armies.
So, a final thought to leave you with. When the political and social ground shifts so radically as it did in France, how long can the old ways of war and the leaders committed to them really survive?
That's the enduring question, isn't it? The French military revolution shows that when the context changes dramatically, military doctrine and leadership must adapt or be swept away.